The doorbell rang at 8:40 on a Tuesday night, and I knew something was wrong before I even saw who was standing on our porch, because nobody who actually likes us shows up unannounced on a weeknight without texting first. I was in the kitchen finishing the dishes when I heard Ryan's footsteps cross the living room, heard the door open, and then heard a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years, a voice that used to make my stomach drop the second I heard it come up the stairs of our old apartment. "I need to talk to you about your wife," the voice said, low and urgent, the specific tone of someone who has rehearsed a speech in the car the whole drive over. I set down the plate I was holding and moved toward the hallway, my hands suddenly cold, watching my husband's silhouette fill the doorway, blocking Derek Walsh from stepping one single inch further onto our porch. "I already know," Ryan said. 3 words, delivered so calmly, so completely without hesitation, that I watched Derek's entire rehearsed speech collapse in real time on our front steps, his mouth opening and closing once before any sound came out. If you're interested in this story, please support this channel by subscribing and leaving a like. Your warm support gives me a lot of strength, especially on the days when telling the story out loud still takes more out of me than I expect it to. I stood frozen in the hallway for a moment, watching the man I had spent 2 years trying to forget stand on the porch of the home I had spent 5 years building without him, and I felt something in me that I hadn't expected to feel, not fear exactly, but a strange, steady clarity, the specific calm of realizing that the story Derek had come to tell had already been told months earlier by me, to the one person whose opinion of me actually mattered. Whatever speech he had rehearsed on the drive over, whatever careful, sympathetic framing he'd practiced in his own head, had just collided with a truth he clearly hadn't planned for, and I could see it landing on his face in real time. My name is Nicole Foster. I'm 31 years old, and I teach 3rd grade at an elementary school in Denver, Colorado, in a quiet tree-lined neighborhood not far from the small craftsman bungalow my husband, Ryan, and I bought together just 8 months before the night Derek Walsh showed up on our porch. Some days, standing in front of my classroom watching a room full of 8-year-olds learn long division, it is almost impossible to reconcile that version of my life with the one I'm about to describe, and yet both of them belong to the same person. I've taught at the same school for 6 years now, ever since finishing my education degree, and there is a specific, uncomplicated joy in spending my days surrounded by 8-year-olds who have not yet learned to doubt their own memory of events, who say exactly what they mean and trust, without hesitation, that the adults around them will believe them. Ryan works as a firefighter for the city, a job that has taught him, among other things, how to stay perfectly steady in moments when everyone else's instinct is to panic, a trait I noticed almost immediately when we first met and came to rely on more than I ever expected to in the years that followed. I met him almost 4 years after I finally, permanently, ended things with Derek, and I told him everything, all of it, before we were ever officially a couple, because I had learned, the hard way, exactly what it costs a person to build a relationship on a foundation of things left unsaid. I met Derek Walsh when I was 24 years old, at a mutual friend's birthday party, standing near a cooler of drinks in someone's backyard, both of us reaching for the same can of soda at the same moment, laughing about it in a way that felt, at the time, like the beginning of every romantic comedy I'd ever watched. He asked for my number before the party ended, texted me before I'd even made it home that night, and for the first several months, he was exactly the kind of attentive, charming, almost overwhelming presence that feels, in the beginning, like being chosen by someone special. He texted constantly. He showed up to surprise me at work with coffee. He told me within 6 weeks that he'd never felt this way about anyone before, and I remember believing, at 24, that this kind of intensity was simply what real love felt like, because nobody had ever taught me the difference between passion and control. The shift happened slowly enough that I spent most of the first year genuinely unable to name what was happening to me. It started with small comments about my friends, pointed observations about how often I saw them, how much time I spent on things that weren't him. It progressed into him checking my phone while I was in the shower, not asking, simply checking, and then acting wounded, almost betrayed, if I expressed any discomfort about it, twisting the conversation until somehow I was the one apologizing for making him feel like he couldn't trust me. By the second year, I had quietly stopped making plans with people outside of our shared circle, had started running every decision, what I wore, where I went, who I talked to, through some invisible filter of whether it would upset him, without ever fully admitting to myself that this was the shape my entire life had taken. I remember one specific evening, maybe a year and a half in, when Priya invited me to a friend's birthday dinner, something ordinary and unremarkable that would have taken maybe 2 hours out of my week. Derek didn't tell me not to go. He never did anything quite that direct. Instead, he grew quiet over dinner that night, answering my questions in clipped, monosyllabic responses until I finally asked what was wrong. "I just think it's interesting," he said, not looking up from his plate, "that you'd rather spend your Friday with people who don't even really know you than with me." I remember the specific sinking feeling of recalibrating my own plans in real time, canceling on Priya 20 minutes later with some vague excuse about being tired, watching Derek's mood lift instantly the second I hung up the phone, as though my exhaustion were a small price worth paying for his approval. It took me embarrassingly long, looking back, to notice how often that exact pattern repeated itself, how rarely, by the end, I actually saw anyone who wasn't also in the room with him. Another time, closer to the end, I mentioned offhand that I'd been thinking about signing up for a pottery class one of my coworkers kept raving about, something small and entirely mine that had nothing to do with him at all. Derek's response was immediate and strangely wounded. "Why do you need something separate from us?" he asked, as though the very idea of a hobby constituted some kind of betrayal. I remember explaining patiently that having my own interests didn't take anything away from our relationship, and I remember him going quiet in that particular way that always preceded several days of cold, punishing distance, until I finally apologized for bringing it up at all and quietly let the idea drop. I never did sign up for that class, not until years later, well into my life with Ryan, who not only encouraged me to enroll but showed up, unprompted, to the small gallery show at the end of the semester holding a bouquet of flowers, beaming with a pride that had nothing performative about it at all. I want to be careful here about how much detail I give you, because some of what happened during those years isn't mine to turn into entertainment, and some of it still isn't easy for me to put into words even now, sitting comfortably in a life that looks nothing like the one I used to live. I've told this part of the story to a handful of people over the years, and every single time, some old, reflexive part of me still braces for disbelief before the words even finish leaving my mouth. What I can tell you is that the emotional control eventually became something physical, an incident during an argument in our second year together that left a bruise on my arm I spent the following week covering with long sleeves in the middle of a Colorado summer, and a second incident, worse than the first, that finally, mercifully, scared me enough to call my best friend Priya from a gas station bathroom at 11 at night instead of driving home. Priya didn't ask a single question that night beyond where I was. She simply told me to stay exactly where I was standing, and 20 minutes later, she pulled into that gas station parking lot, took one look at my face under the fluorescent lights, and pulled me into a hug so fierce it nearly knocked the breath out of me. "We're getting you out," she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact, the kind of certainty I desperately needed from someone else because I no longer had any certainty left of my own. She helped me pack up my life over the following week while Derek was traveling for work, driving box after box to her apartment in the evenings after her own job, never once making me explain more than I was ready to, never once asking why it had taken me this long, moving me into her spare bedroom before he even had a chance to notice I was gone. I filed for restraining order 2 weeks later, with the help of a domestic violence advocate at a local non-profit named Sandra, who walked me through a process I was too numb and too frightened to navigate on my own, sitting with me for nearly 3 hours while I filled out forms with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, pausing every so often to hand me a tissue or simply let the silence sit until I was ready to keep going. "You did the hardest part already," Sandra told me that afternoon, squeezing my hand before I walked into the courtroom for the first time. "Everything from here is just paperwork." I kept every piece of documentation from that period in a manila folder I still, to this day, have never fully thrown away, photographs of the bruising, screenshots of messages that ranged from desperate to threatening once he realized I was actually leaving, a copy of the police report from the night a neighbor called them during our worst argument, and the restraining order itself, granted for 1 year. Expired long before Derek ever showed up on my new porch, but still, somehow the single most important piece of paper I owned. What I didn't fully understand, in the immediate aftermath of leaving Derek, was that he wasn't simply going to disappear quietly from my life once the restraining order forced physical distance between us. Men like Derek don't experience being left as a consequence of their own behavior. They experience it as a wound inflicted on them by someone else, and wounded men, in my experience, tend to look for ways to even the score, even when the score was never actually uneven to begin with. Within a month of my leaving, mutual friends started reaching out to me with increasingly strange messages, gently asking if everything was all right, if there was something going on they should know about. It took me embarrassingly long to piece together what was happening, that Derek had begun quietly, methodically rewriting the story of our relationship to anyone who would listen, painting himself as the devastated victim of a manipulative, unstable girlfriend who had cheated on him, lied to him constantly, and finally abandoned him without warning after 2 years of what he described as unconditional love and support. He never once mentioned the restraining order. He never once mentioned the bruise Priya had photographed on my arm at that gas station. I remember calling one particular friend, a woman named Kelsey I'd known since college, after she stopped responding to my texts entirely, hoping to salvage something of a friendship I'd genuinely valued. Kelsey answered but sounded uncomfortable from the first word, clearly unwilling to fully engage. "Derek said you cheated on him," she said finally, when I pressed her on why she'd gone quiet. He seemed really torn up about it. I remember the specific, dizzying sensation of hearing a fabricated version of my own life recited back to me by someone I'd trusted for years. "I didn't cheat on him, Kelsey," I said. "He hurt me. There's a restraining order. I can send you the paperwork if you want proof instead of just his word." There was a long, uncomfortable silence on the line before she finally said, quietly, "I don't really know what to believe anymore," and I remember hanging up the phone feeling something break inside me that took years of therapy to fully repair, the specific grief of realizing that some people will always choose the version of events that requires the least discomfort from them, regardless of which version happens to be true. He simply built a version of events cruel and detailed enough that several people I had once considered close friends quietly stopped responding to my texts altogether, unwilling, I suppose, to pick a side in a conflict they only understood from one direction. I spent the better part of 2 years afterward in therapy, slowly untangling what had happened to me, learning the specific vocabulary for patterns I had lived inside without ever having names for: coercive control, gaslighting, isolation. I remember the first time Dr. Alvarez used the word abuse to describe what I'd survived, and how instinctively I wanted to argue with her, to explain that it hadn't been that bad, that other people had it so much worse, that surely a relationship without visible, constant violence didn't deserve such a heavy word. She let me talk myself through that resistance for several sessions before gently pointing out that minimizing what happened to me wasn't protecting me from anything. It was simply protecting Derek from the full weight of what he'd actually done. My therapist, a patient, exacting woman named Dr. Alvarez, told me something during one of our early sessions that I have carried with me ever since. The people who believe his version without ever asking for yours were never going to be the people who actually kept you safe, she said. Their absence isn't a loss. It's information. Slowly, over those 2 years, I rebuilt pieces of myself I hadn't realized I'd let atrophy, made new friends who had never met Derek and therefore carried no complicated allegiance to his version of events, took up running, started actually enjoying my own company again instead of experiencing solitude as something to be filled or feared. I met Ryan almost 2 years after I finished actively working through the worst of that recovery, at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue, of all places, the same unglamorous setting where I'd first met Derek years earlier, though the two men could not have been more different if I designed them in a laboratory specifically to contrast each other. He was standing near the grill, quietly helping our host flip burgers rather than working the crowd, and when I made some offhand joke about the burnt one clearly being reserved for whoever showed up last, he laughed, an easy, genuine sound, and told me he'd already claimed that one for himself on principle. Ryan was quiet in a way that felt grounded rather than guarded, funny without needing to perform, and most notably, entirely uninterested in monopolizing my attention the way Derek always had, content to let conversations drift naturally rather than steering them relentlessly back toward himself. We talked for maybe 20 minutes at that barbecue, about nothing important, his job, a hiking trip he'd just returned from, and I remember driving home afterward feeling something I hadn't felt in years, a small, cautious curiosity about someone that didn't come preloaded with a familiar, exhausting kind of dread. He texted our mutual friend for my number a few days later, rather than asking for it directly at the party, a small, old-fashioned gesture I found unexpectedly reassuring, the specific patience of someone who didn't seem to need things to move quickly to know they mattered. We started dating slowly, deliberately, both of us clearly a little wary of moving too fast for reasons neither of us had fully explained to the other yet. I remember one early date, maybe our third or fourth, when I instinctively flinched at a sudden loud noise from a passing car, and instead of teasing me about it or brushing past the moment the way I half expected him to, Ryan simply paused, asked quietly if I was all right, and waited for my answer before continuing our conversation, no impatience in his voice at all. I noticed, in small moments like that one, an attentiveness that felt entirely different from the attentiveness I'd once mistaken for love with Derek, less about monitoring me and more about simply making sure I felt safe enough to exist comfortably in whatever space we happened to be sharing. About 2 months in, sitting on his back porch on a warm evening, I told him everything. I remember my hands shaking as I spoke, bracing myself for the same subtle skepticism I'd encountered from a few people over the years, the well-meaning but ultimately damaging impulse to ask what I might have done to provoke things, whether I was remembering it all accurately, whether there might be some more balanced version of events I was leaving out. Ryan didn't ask any of those questions. He simply listened all the way through, his jaw tightening at certain details but his eyes never once leaving mine, and when I finished, he asked only one thing. "Do you still have that documentation somewhere safe?" he asked. "I want you to know that whatever you need, whenever you need it, I'm not going anywhere." I showed him the manila folder about a month later, not because he demanded proof, but because I wanted him to understand the full shape of what I'd survived, and I remember watching his jaw tighten as he looked through the photographs, the restraining order, the old police report, watching something protective and quietly furious settle behind his eyes that had nothing to do with doubting me, and everything to do with wishing he could have been there to stop it from happening in the first place. I introduced Ryan to my parents about 3 months into dating, more nervous about that particular dinner than I'd expected to be, aware that my mother and father had watched me disappear into Derek's version of our relationship years earlier and had every reason to be cautious about any man I brought home afterward. My father, never a particularly talkative man, spent most of the dinner quietly observing Ryan, watching how he treated the waitstaff, how he listened when I spoke instead of simply waiting for his turn to talk, the small, unglamorous tells my father had apparently learned to watch for after everything our family had been through. On the drive home that night, my mother called me, her voice warm in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Your father actually smiled during dessert," she said. "Do you understand how rare that is? I think he finally believes you found someone who deserves you." We dated for 2 years before Ryan proposed, on a hiking trail outside the city on a crisp October morning, getting down on one knee at an overlook we'd hiked to on our very first weekend trip together, a detail he later admitted he'd been planning for months. Waiting for the right moment to circle back to the place where he'd first realized he wanted to build an entire life with me. I said yes without a single moment of hesitation, understanding by then, with total clarity, exactly what it felt like to be loved by someone who had never once needed me to shrink myself to make him comfortable. We married the following spring in a small ceremony at a lodge outside the city, close family and friends gathered under string lights, my father walking me down a short grass aisle while my mother cried the specific, unguarded tears of a woman who had spent years quietly worrying whether her daughter would ever trust anyone again. Priya stood beside me as my maid of honor, and during her toast, she raised her glass and said, simply, "I've watched this woman rebuild her entire life from the ground up, and Ryan, I need you to know exactly how much trust you're being handed tonight. Don't waste it." Ryan, glancing at me with an expression I'll never forget, simply nodded and said, "I know exactly what I've been given." 8 months ago, we bought our first house together, a modest craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch and a garden Ryan had already started planning before we'd even signed the closing paperwork, the kind of quiet, ordinary domestic happiness I had once genuinely believed I might never get to have. I hadn't thought about Derek Walsh in any sustained way for almost a year before the night he showed up on that porch. Occasionally his name would surface in some old mutual friend's social media post, a wedding, a promotion, the ordinary noise of a life continuing somewhere I no longer had to think about. I had no idea, in the weeks leading up to that Tuesday evening, that he had apparently seen our own wedding photos through a mutual acquaintance's account, had somehow tracked down our new address through public property records, and had spent enough time stewing over the specific, unbearable fact of my happiness that he'd finally decided, 3 years after I left him, that showing up unannounced to warn my new husband was a reasonable, even noble, thing to do. That Tuesday had been an entirely unremarkable day up until 8:40 that evening, the kind of quiet weeknight that had become the comfortable backbone of our new marriage, grading a stack of third-grade math worksheets at the kitchen table while Ryan made spaghetti, both of us talking idly about whether to repaint the guest room over the coming weekend. I remember thinking, stacking the last of the worksheets into my bag for the next morning, how completely ordinary my life had become, how thoroughly the specific vigilance I used to carry everywhere with me had finally, quietly, faded into something closer to peace. I had no idea, drying the last plate and setting it in the rack, that peace was about to be interrupted by a voice from a chapter of my life I had genuinely believed was finished. I was in the kitchen finishing the dishes that Tuesday evening when the doorbell rang. Ryan settled on the couch scrolling through something on his phone, both of us entirely unprepared for what was about to unfold on our own front porch. I heard him get up, heard the door open, and then heard a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years, low and urgent, clearly rehearsed. "I need to talk to you about your wife," Derek said. I set down the plate I was holding and moved toward the hallway, my heart suddenly pounding, watching my husband's silhouette fill the doorway, blocking Derek from stepping one single inch further onto our porch. "I already know," Ryan said. The silence that followed lasted just long enough for me to reach the end of the hallway myself, close enough now to see Derek's face clearly over Ryan's shoulder, his rehearsed composure visibly cracking at an answer he clearly hadn't planned for. "You don't understand," Derek said, recovering slightly, his voice climbing toward the urgent, concerned register I remembered from years of watching him talk himself into and out of things. "She's not who you think she is. She's manipulative. She lied to me constantly, cheated on me, and then disappeared without a word after 2 years together. I'm not here to cause trouble, man. I'm here because I wish someone had warned me before I got in too deep." Ryan didn't move an inch from the doorway. "That's interesting," he said, his voice remarkably calm given the circumstances, "because Nicole showed me the restraining order you're not mentioning, the police report from the night your neighbor called them, and the photographs of the bruise on her arm from the last time you put your hands on her. So I'm going to give you exactly one chance to turn around and get back in your car, or I'm calling the police right now and letting them sort out why a man with an expired restraining order against him is standing on my porch trying to rewrite history for an audience that already knows the ending." I watched the color drain from Derek's face in the porch light, watched him glance past Ryan's shoulder and see me standing there, arms crossed, entirely unafraid in a way that must have looked, to him, like the single most infuriating thing he'd witnessed in years. "Nicole," he said, his voice shifting instantly into something softer, more wounded, an old, familiar tactic I recognized immediately even after 3 years apart. "I just wanted him to know the truth before you did to him what you did to me." I felt something steady and cold settle over me, the specific calm that comes from finally, completely, no longer needing this particular person's approval or understanding. "I already told him everything, Derek," I said. "All of it. The truth, not your version of it. You didn't come here to protect him. You came here because you saw our wedding photos and couldn't stand that I built a life you weren't in." Derek's jaw tightened, his composure fully cracking now. "You always did think you were better than everyone," he snapped, the mask finally slipping entirely. "I gave you everything, and you ran off and told people I was some kind of monster." I looked at him steadily, feeling none of the fear that used to accompany that particular tone of voice. "I didn't tell people anything," I said. "A restraining order isn't gossip, Derek. It's a legal document a judge signed after reviewing evidence. If people think you're a monster, it's because of what you actually did, not because of anything I said about it." He turned back toward Ryan, apparently deciding a new tactic might land better than the last one. "You don't know her like I do, man," he said, his voice taking on a wounded, confiding tone I remembered all too well from years of arguments that always somehow ended with me comforting him. "She'll do this to you too, eventually. She'll make you feel crazy for things that were never actually your fault. Ryan let out a short, humorless laugh, the first real edge I'd heard in his voice all night. That's funny, he said, because in 3 years together, Nicole has never once made me doubt my own memory of a conversation, never once checked my phone without asking, and never once left a bruise on my arm that I had to explain away with long sleeves in July. I think you're describing yourself, Derek, not her. You just got the pronouns backwards. Ryan, still standing perfectly still in the doorway, finally spoke again, his voice losing none of its calm but gaining an edge I hadn't heard from him before. I'm going to say this once, he said. You need to leave this property right now, and you need to never come back here again. If you contact my wife, if you show up at her school, if you so much as drive down this street again, I am going to the police with everything we have, and given that this house has a doorbell camera that has been recording this entire conversation, I don't think a judge is going to have much trouble understanding exactly what kind of man is standing on my porch right now. I watched Derek's eyes flick upward toward the small camera mounted above our door, watched real fear finally register on his face for the first time since he'd arrived, the specific fear of a man who had spent years controlling the narrative suddenly realizing the narrative was no longer his to control. He backed off the porch without another word, got into his car, and drove away, and I remember standing in that doorway with Ryan's arm around my shoulders, both of us watching his taillights disappear down the street, feeling something complicated settle in my chest, relief tangled up with a resurgence of old fear I thought I'd finally outrun. I called Priya the moment we got back inside, my hands still shaking as I recounted every detail of what had just happened on our porch. She was quiet for a moment after I finished, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same fierce, protective certainty I remembered from that gas station parking lot years earlier. He drove to your house, she said slowly, as though saying it out loud might help her fully believe it. After everything, after years of no contact, he drove to your actual home to try to plant doubt in your husband's head. Nicole, I need you to hear me say this. That is not the behavior of someone who has moved on. That is the behavior of someone who needs to be taken seriously as a threat, starting right now. I told her about the doorbell camera, about Ryan's calm, immovable response, and I heard her exhale slowly on the other end of the line. Thank God you married someone who didn't need convincing, she said. Do you know how many women don't get that? I did know, more intimately than I wished I did, having watched more than one friend over the years quietly talk herself out of trusting her own memory because the person she loved needed more proof than her word alone. I remember hanging up the phone that night feeling profoundly, quietly grateful for exactly how far I'd come from the woman who used to apologize for canceling dinner plans. Ryan told his captain about the incident the following day, mostly, he later admitted, because he needed to explain why he'd need a little flexibility with his schedule over the coming weeks for the legal proceedings. His captain, a gruff, unflappable man named Hutchins who had worked alongside Ryan for nearly a decade, listened to the whole story without interrupting, then simply said, "Whatever you need, take it. We've got your shifts covered." A few of Ryan's fellow firefighters, men I'd met maybe a handful of times at department barbecues, started quietly checking in on me over the following weeks. One of them, a broad-shouldered paramedic named Ortiz, even offering to swing by our house on his days off just to make his presence visibly known on our street. I don't scare easily, Ortiz told me with a small grin, dropping off a box of pastries from his wife's bakery one Saturday morning, but I scare pretty easily on behalf of people I care about. Ryan's part of our family. That makes you part of it too. The morning after Derek's visit, Ryan spent his day off calling a local security company, and by that evening we had 2 additional cameras installed, one covering the backyard and one covering the driveway, along with new motion sensor lighting that Ryan tested obsessively for nearly an hour after the installers left. I watched him work, feeling a complicated mixture of gratitude and grief, grateful for a husband who took action instead of simply offering reassurance, grieving the fact that I had once again found myself needing to fortify a home against a man who had already taken so much from an earlier version of my life. I also called Sandra, the domestic violence advocate who had helped me file my original restraining order years earlier, surprised to find her still working at the same non-profit after all this time. She remembered my case immediately, her voice warming as soon as I said my name. "Nicole," she said, "I think about you sometimes, wondering how you're doing. I'm so sorry to hear he's resurfaced. I filled her in on everything, the wedding photos, the property records, the porch confrontation, and she walked me through updating my safety plan for our new house, small, practical details, which neighbors to alert, which route to take if I ever needed to leave quickly, that felt at once reassuring and exhausting to have to think through all over again after finally believing I'd left that kind of vigilance behind for good. Before we hung up, Sandra said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. The fact that you called me immediately, calmly, with a clear head, tells me everything about how far you've come, she said. The woman who first sat in my office years ago wouldn't have known where to start. You do now. That's not nothing, Nicole. That's everything. I want to tell you that was the end of it, that Derek understood the message clearly enough to disappear permanently from our lives after that single humiliating encounter on our porch. It wasn't. Within a week, we discovered he had found my school's general contact email and sent a long, rambling message to the front office, framed as a concerned former partner worried about my mental stability, suggesting, without any evidence whatsoever, that I might pose some vague, unspecified risk to the children in my classroom. I found out about the email on a Thursday morning when the front office called my classroom during my planning period, asking me to come down between periods, their tone carefully neutral in a way that immediately set off alarm bells after years of learning to read exactly that kind of forced calm. I remember the walk down that hallway feeling impossibly long, my mind racing through every possible reason I might be summoned, landing, somehow, nowhere close to the actual truth waiting for me in the principal's office. The school's principal, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Castellano, called me into her office the following morning, clearly uncomfortable but obligated to address a formal complaint regardless of how baseless it might turn out to be. I sat across from Diane's desk, my hands cold, watching her slide the printed email across the table toward me. The email itself, once I actually read it, was worse than I braced for, several paragraphs of carefully worded concern that managed to imply, without ever quite stating outright, that I had a history of instability and manipulation that any responsible school should investigate before allowing me continued access to children. I felt something in my stomach twist reading my own supposed instability described in such clinical, concerned language by the one person who had actually caused every ounce of instability I'd ever experienced. Nicole, she said carefully, I want you to know I don't for a second believe there's anything to this, but I have to ask you directly, given that a formal complaint was submitted. Is there anything in your personal history I should be aware of that might explain why this individual would send something like this? I felt a familiar, exhausting weariness settle over me, the specific fatigue of having to defend myself, once again, against a story someone else had constructed entirely out of malice. I told her everything, the relationship, the abuse, the restraining order, the recent confrontation at my house, watching her expression shift from cautious professionalism into something closer to genuine anger on my behalf by the time I finished. I have the original police report and restraining order at home if you need copies for your file, I told her, my voice steadier than I expected. I'd rather you have the actual documentation than just my word against his. Diane shook her head slightly. I believe you, Nicole, she said. But you're right, I'll want copies for the file, not because I doubt you, but because if this man ever tries something like this again, I want the school fully prepared to shut it down immediately. This is harassment, Diane said flatly, setting the email down. I'm documenting this formally on our end, and I'd strongly encourage you to loop in law enforcement, because sending something like this to a school, implying a teacher poses a risk to children with zero evidence, isn't just cruel. In some contexts, it can constitute a form of criminal harassment on its own. That same week, Ryan and I sat down with a family law attorney named Patricia Nunez, a sharp, methodical woman who specialized in domestic violence and stalking cases, bringing with us the doorbell camera footage from the porch confrontation, the email Derek had sent to my school, and the old manila folder I had carried with me through 3 different apartments and 1 marriage, the original restraining order, the police report, the photographs I had hoped, for years, I would never need to look at again. Patricia watched the doorbell footage twice before saying anything, her expression hardening slightly further on the second viewing. I want you to know something important, she said, looking directly at me. Nothing about what you're describing suggests a man who made one poor decision out of lingering feelings. This is a pattern, a deliberate escalation, from showing up uninvited, to refusing to leave when directly confronted, to contacting your employer with baseless claims clearly designed to threaten your livelihood. Courts take this kind of pattern extremely seriously, especially layered on top of a documented history of abuse and a prior restraining order. I asked her, my voice smaller than I intended, whether this meant I'd have to relive the entire original relationship in court again, whether Derek's attorney would try to pick apart details from years earlier that I could barely stand to think about, let alone testify to under oath. Patricia's expression softened slightly. It's possible some of that history comes up, she said, but Nicole, that history isn't a liability in this case. It's exactly the evidence that makes his current behavior look precisely like what it is. About a week before the hearing, Patricia called me with something that changed my understanding of the entire situation, her voice careful in a way that told me before she'd even finished her sentence that whatever she'd found wasn't going to be easy to hear. While researching Derek's background for the case, she said, I came across a matter of public record from about 2 years ago, a civil protective order filed against him by another woman in Boulder, granted and then allowed to expire after roughly a year, remarkably similar circumstances to your own. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me, some old, familiar nausea rising at the confirmation of something I think I had always feared but never allowed myself to fully consider, that I hadn't simply been an isolated chapter in Derek's life, but one entry in a pattern he had continued, uninterrupted, with someone else entirely. I sat with that news for several days before finally telling Ryan the full details, watching his expression shift from anger into something quieter and more resolved. Do you want to reach out to her? He asked eventually, meaning the other woman in Boulder. I considered the question carefully. Part of me desperately wanted to offer some form of solidarity to a stranger who had likely spent her own version of these same sleepless nights. But Patricia had cautioned me against direct contact before the hearing concluded, worried it might complicate the proceedings or expose either of us to further harassment if Derek somehow learned of it. I decided in the end to wait, promising myself that once everything was resolved, I would try to find a respectful way to let her know she wasn't the only one, and that whatever version of him she'd survived, she hadn't imagined a single bit of it either. I don't know her name, Patricia told me gently, and I won't pursue contacting her without her own attorney's involvement, but I wanted you to know this exists, both because it may become relevant to the case and because I imagine it changes something for you to hear it. It did change something, though not in the way I might have expected. I didn't feel vindicated exactly, or even surprised, not really. I felt, instead, a fresh, complicated grief for a woman I had never met, someone who had presumably lived through some version of what I had, who had presumably also spent years wondering if she'd simply misremembered or overreacted, and I found myself hoping, fiercely, that wherever she was now, she had found her own version of the calm, steady safety I had finally managed to build for myself. That night, unable to sleep, I sat at our kitchen table and wrote a letter I knew I would never send, addressed to a woman whose name I didn't even know, simply because I needed somewhere to put the specific ache of learning I wasn't alone in this. I hope you found people who believed you the first time, I wrote. I hope you're not still explaining yourself to anyone. I hope, wherever you are, you've built something he can't reach. I folded the letter and tucked it into the same manila folder that held everything else from those years, understanding, as I did, that it belonged there too, another piece of evidence not for any court but for myself, proof that the story I had survived was bigger and older than any single relationship, proof that surviving it and speaking honestly about it might, in some small way I would never get to witness, help someone else find their own exit sooner than I had found mine. Patricia reviewed everything methodically, her expression growing progressively more serious as she moved through the timeline. This is a clear pattern of escalating harassment, she said finally. The porch confrontation alone might have been dismissed as a poor decision by someone with lingering misplaced feelings, but combined with contacting your workplace and making unfounded implications about your fitness to work around children, this has moved well past anything that could reasonably be characterized as a misunderstanding. I want to file for a new restraining order immediately, one with a longer duration and broader terms than the original, and I want to formally report the email to your school as a documented incident of harassment that we can use to establish a pattern if this continues. Ryan asked at one point during that meeting whether there was anything he personally needed to do differently, whether his response on the porch that night might have somehow escalated things further than a quieter approach would have. Patricia shook her head firmly. "What you did was exactly right," she told him. "Men like this rely on ambiguity, on the other person hesitating just long enough to give them an opening to keep talking, keep reframing, keep working the room. You gave him zero ambiguity, and you documented the entire interaction on camera in the process. If anything, that response probably did more to protect Nicole than a dozen strongly worded letters could have." She glanced between the two of us before adding one more thing. "I've handled a lot of cases like this," she said, "and I don't often get to say this, but the two of you clearly built something together long before this man ever showed up on your porch. That foundation matters more than people realize. It's the difference between a marriage that cracks under this kind of pressure and one that simply gets stronger." The restraining order hearing took place 3 weeks later in a Denver courtroom, and I remember sitting in the gallery beside Ryan, my hands cold despite the overheated room, watching Derek walk in wearing a suit that looked borrowed, accompanied by a public defender who offered little in the way of meaningful defense once Patricia laid out the full timeline, the original restraining order from years earlier, the doorbell footage showing him refusing to leave our property until directly confronted, the email sent to my school with its thinly veiled implications. I testified that afternoon, my voice shaking at first before steadying somewhere around the third question, describing not just the porch confrontation but the years of fear that had preceded it, the specific, lasting damage of learning that your own history can be weaponized by someone determined enough to keep rewriting it. Patricia asked me, toward the end of my testimony, why I believed Derek had shown up at my house after 3 years of no contact. "I don't think he came to warn my husband about anything," I said, looking directly at the judge rather than at Derek. "I think he saw that I was happy, and he couldn't stand it, and coming to my house was the only way he still knew how to try to take something back from me." Derek attempted, at one point during his own brief testimony, to characterize himself as someone who had simply wanted to warn a fellow man about a woman he genuinely believed to be dangerous, a narrative the judge received with visible, barely concealed skepticism given the sheer volume of contradicting evidence sitting on her bench. Patricia, during her closing argument, referenced the Boulder Protective Order carefully, framing it not as an accusation from an uninvolved party but as a matter of public record demonstrating a pattern rather than an isolated incident. "Your Honor," she said, "the court doesn't need to take my client's word alone that this is a pattern of behavior rather than a single lapse in judgment. Public court records from another jurisdiction show a strikingly similar protective order filed against Mr. Walsh roughly 2 years ago." I watched Derek's face during that moment, watched something crumple behind his eyes that looked, for the first time all afternoon, less like indignation and more like a man finally confronting the full scope of what his own choices had built. "Mr. Walsh," the judge said at one point, cutting through his rambling explanation, "you are describing yourself as concerned for this man's welfare while simultaneously admitting you drove to his private residence, refused to leave when confronted, and subsequently contacted your ex-partner's employer with unsubstantiated claims about her fitness to work with children. I want to be very direct with you. This court does not see concern in this pattern of behavior. This court sees someone unable to accept that a relationship has ended and is using increasingly aggressive tactics to insert himself back into a life he no longer has any claim to." The new restraining order was granted, 5 years in duration this time, with explicit provisions prohibiting contact not only with me directly but with my workplace, my husband, and our shared residence, along with a formal notation in the court record acknowledging the pattern of behavior Patricia had established through the Boulder evidence. Derek left that courtroom without another word, his shoulders slumped in a way that looked almost unrecognizable compared to the confident, rehearsed man who had stood on our porch weeks earlier, and for the first time since that Tuesday evening, I allowed myself to believe, cautiously, that the situation might actually be over. I went back to work the following Monday grateful, in a way I hadn't fully anticipated, for the specific, uncomplicated demands of a classroom full of 8-year-olds who had no idea any of this had happened and needed nothing more complicated for me than help sounding out spelling words and settling minor disputes over classroom pencils. I remember standing at the front of my classroom that morning, watching my students file in with their backpacks and their half-finished breakfasts, feeling something in my chest loosen for the first time in weeks. One of my students, a shy little girl named Maddie who rarely spoke up in class, came up to my desk during free reading time and handed me a drawing she'd made over the weekend, a stick figure family standing in front of a house with a bright yellow sun overhead. "I don't know why," she said, "but I thought you'd like it." I kept that drawing taped to the inside of my desk drawer for months afterward, a small, unexpected reminder of exactly how much ordinary goodness still existed in the world outside of courtrooms and restraining orders. It wasn't, not entirely, not for several more months. The stress of that period, the porch confrontation, the school complaint, the courtroom proceedings, took a visible toll on my own family, particularly my mother, Carol, who had watched me survive the original relationship years earlier and found herself reliving every ounce of that fear in real time as this new chapter unfolded. My mother has managed high blood pressure for years, something she has always treated with more casualness than her doctors would prefer, and the accumulated stress of watching her daughter face this kind of harassment again finally caught up with her about a month after the restraining order hearing, landing her in the emergency room with what doctors described as a hypertensive crisis brought on by prolonged, acute stress. I got the call from my father on a Sunday afternoon, his voice tighter and more frightened than I had ever heard it, explaining that my mother had complained of chest tightness and dizziness after a phone call with her sister discussing the courtroom proceedings in more detail than she'd realized she was still carrying. I drove to the hospital with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, Ryan following close behind in his own car since we'd been at separate errands when the call came through, and I remember the specific, sick feeling of walking into that emergency room and understanding, with total clarity, that Derek's campaign to disrupt my life had now reached into a generation of my family that had never done anything except love me. I remember sitting in that hospital waiting room with Ryan and my father, feeling a familiar, exhausting guilt settle over me, the specific guilt of believing, however irrationally, that my own history had somehow put my mother's health at risk. Ryan, sensing exactly where my thoughts had gone, took my hand firmly in his. "This isn't your fault, Nicole," he said quietly. "Derek did this. Not you. You didn't choose to be stalked and harassed by a man who can't handle rejection, and you certainly didn't choose your mother's blood pressure. Don't let him take one more thing from this family by making you carry guilt that was never yours to carry in the first place." My mother recovered fully within a couple of weeks, her doctors adjusting her medication and finally, firmly insisting she take her hypertension more seriously going forward, a conversation I think she'd needed to have with herself for years regardless of Derek's involvement in triggering it. Sitting beside her hospital bed during her recovery, I found myself telling her, in more detail than I ever had before, exactly what those 2 years with Derek had actually been like, the isolation, the phone checking, the two specific incidents I had never fully described to her before, watching her face shift through grief, anger, and finally a fierce, protective resolve I hadn't fully seen from her since I was a child. "I wish you'd told me sooner," she said, gripping my hand. "Not because I would have judged you, Nicole, but because you shouldn't have had to carry any of that alone for as long as you did." I tried to explain, haltingly, that shame had kept me quiet for years, the specific, illogical shame of believing that admitting what had happened to me would somehow reflect poorly on my own judgment rather than on the man who had actually caused it. My mother squeezed my hand tighter. "That shame belongs to him," she said firmly. "Every bit of it. I don't ever want to hear you apologize again for something that was done to you." Before I left the hospital that evening, my mother asked me one more question, her voice quieter than before. "Does Ryan know all of this?" she asked. I nodded. "Every bit of it," I told her. "He's known since almost the beginning." My mother's eyes filled with tears again, though this time they seemed lighter somehow, relief rather than grief. "Then you found exactly what you deserved," she said. "I only wish it hadn't taken so much pain to get there." In the months following the restraining order hearing, word of what had happened, the porch confrontation, the harassment of my workplace, the courtroom proceedings, spread quietly through our small circle of mutual acquaintances, the same people who had once believed Derek's carefully constructed version of our breakup years earlier. Several of them reached out to me, awkwardly, apologetically, admitting they'd never fully questioned the story he'd told them at the time, admitting, too, that watching this more recent chapter unfold had made it impossible to keep believing him. Kelsey, the same friend who had gone cold on me years earlier after Derek's version of events reached her first, sent me a long message one evening that I read 3 times before responding. I owe you an apology I should have given years ago, it read. I heard what happened at your house, and I heard about the restraining order, and I finally looked up the case in the public court records because I couldn't stop thinking about it. Nicole, I am so sorry I believed him over you. I don't have a good excuse. It was just easier, and I hate that I let easier matter more than the truth. I wrote her back eventually, not with the warmth our old friendship might once have deserved, but with something honest. I appreciate you saying that, I told her. I'm not sure what our friendship looks like now, but I'm glad you finally see it clearly. I didn't feel much satisfaction in those apologies, arriving as they did years too late to undo the isolation I'd experienced in the immediate aftermath of leaving him, but I appreciated them anyway, understanding that people sometimes need to see a pattern repeat itself before they're willing to fully believe the person who lived through the first version of it. Derek, for his part, seemed to finally understand, somewhere in the months following the second restraining order, that his campaign to insert himself back into my life had cost him considerably more than it had ever cost me. I heard, secondhand, through the same shrinking circle of mutual acquaintances, that he had lost his job not long after the courtroom proceedings, his employer apparently uncomfortable continuing to associate with someone whose harassment case had become a matter of public court record, easily searchable by anyone curious enough to look. Priya, who ran into someone from Derek's old office at a conference that spring, told me his manager had apparently called him into HR the same week the local paper ran a small item about the hearing, a brief, factual paragraph buried in the court section that nonetheless proved impossible for a small company to simply ignore once a client happened to mention having read it. I heard, too, that he had moved out of Denver entirely sometime that following winter, whether by choice or by the accumulated social and professional consequences of his own actions, I never fully learned, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't particularly need to know. There was a strange, quiet symmetry to it, I thought, watching from a distance as the version of events Derek had spent years carefully constructing finally, publicly, fell apart under its own weight, the same way mine had once been dismissed and picked apart by people who never bothered to ask for more than his side of the story. I didn't feel triumphant watching it happen. Mostly, I just felt tired, the specific exhaustion of having spent the better part of a decade dealing, in one form or another, with the consequences of one relationship I'd entered at 24 with absolutely no idea what I was walking into. Nearly a year after the porch confrontation, I received a text message from an unknown number, one I recognized after a moment, with a familiar drop in my stomach, as belonging to Derek. I know I have no right to reach out, it read. I've spent a lot of time in therapy this year, more than I ever thought I'd need, and I'm starting to understand some of what I did to you, and what I kept doing even after you left. I'm not asking you to respond. I just needed you to know I finally see it. I sat with that message for a long time before deciding what to do with it, turning over the specific, complicated feeling of receiving what sounded, for the first time in years, like genuine accountability instead of another performance designed to win back my sympathy. Part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to imagine some version of closure where the man who had caused so much damage finally, fully understood the weight of it. But I had learned, across years of therapy and one very patient husband, that other people's growth is not my responsibility to manage, validate, or even witness, and that my own healing had never actually depended on Derek reaching this particular realization at all. I read it twice, sitting in the small home office Ryan and I had finished setting up just weeks earlier, feeling something far more complicated than either forgiveness or anger, something closer to a quiet, hard-won indifference, the specific piece of no longer needing this particular person's growth, however genuine it might or might not have been, to validate anything about my own healing. I showed the message to Ryan that evening, mostly out of habit at this point, a commitment we'd made early on to never keep anything related to Derek's secret between us, even something as small as an unsolicited text. Ryan read it, handed the phone back, and simply asked, "How do you feel about it?" I thought about the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "I don't feel much of anything," I told him, "and I think that might be the most healed I've ever felt about any of this." I didn't respond. I deleted the message, closed my laptop, and walked downstairs to find Ryan in the kitchen, halfway through making dinner, humming something off-key the way he always does when he thinks no one's listening. He looked up when I walked in, immediately reading something in my expression. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded, and for the first time in longer than I expected, I found that I meant it completely. "Everything's okay," I told him, and I sat down at our kitchen island, in our house, in the life we had built entirely without room for anyone who had ever tried to convince me I didn't deserve it. I asked Ryan once, a few weeks after the porch confrontation, how he'd managed to stay so completely calm in the moment, how 3 words had come to him so instantly, so certainly, in a situation that would have rattled almost anyone. He thought about the question for a while before answering. "Honestly," he said, "some part of me had been quietly bracing for that exact scenario since the day you first showed me that folder. Not because I thought you'd done anything wrong, but because I understood, even then, that men like that don't usually just fade away on their own. I figured if he ever showed up, the only thing that would actually matter was that he understood immediately he wasn't going to find an opening." I told him I hadn't realized he'd been carrying that particular readiness around with him for years, quietly, without ever once making me feel like I was living under some looming threat. "That's the job, in a way," he said, with a small, tired smile. "You learn how to stay calm for the worst-case scenario without letting it define every ordinary day in between." I figured our marriage deserved the same approach. I think sometimes about that Tuesday evening on our porch, about the specific, devastating calm in Ryan's voice when he said those 3 words, "I already know," and about how completely they dismantled 3 years of a story Derek had spent building in his own head, a story where he was the wrong party and I was the villain who owed him an explanation I had never actually stopped giving, just to people who had finally learned to stop believing him instead. I think about how much of my healing depended on finally being with someone who didn't need convincing, who simply believed me the first time and never once made me relitigate my own trauma to earn his loyalty. A few months ago, Ryan and I found out we're expecting our first child, a piece of news that filled me with a joy so complete it occasionally still catches me off guard in quiet moments, folding tiny clothes in the nursery we've slowly been putting together in the spare room upstairs. Priya came over the weekend, we found out, bringing a ridiculous number of tiny baby outfits she'd apparently been unable to resist buying the moment I told her, and I remember sitting on the floor of the nursery with her, surrounded by soft yellow onesies, feeling a wave of gratitude so intense it nearly brought me to tears. "You know," she said, folding a tiny sock in her hands, "I still think about that gas station parking lot sometimes. Look at you now." I told her I thought about it too. More often than people probably assumed, though these days the memory arrived less as a wound and more as a marker, a specific point on a map showing exactly how far I'd traveled since. My mother has already started knitting a blanket, working through her own worry about Derek's reappearance the way she processes most things, with her hands busy and her television murmuring quietly in the background. My father, never a particularly emotional man, cried the day we told him, something I don't think I'd seen him do since my grandmother's funeral years earlier. Ryan has already started building a small bookshelf for the nursery in our garage on weekends, humming that same off-key tune he hums whenever he's absorbed in something he loves, and I find myself, some evenings, simply standing in the doorway of that half-finished nursery, watching him work, feeling something settle permanently into place inside me. I think about the life growing inside me, and I think about the specific kind of safety I want to build for them, the kind I had to fight so hard to build for myself, and I understand now, with a clarity that took years of therapy and one deeply patient husband to arrive at, that the story of what happened to me was never actually about what Derek took. It was about everything I eventually, deliberately, built back, piece by piece, until the life I have now no longer has any room left for the version of myself who used to apologize for things that were never her fault to begin with. I plan to tell my child, someday, an age-appropriate version of exactly what their mother survived, not as a burden to carry, but as proof that fear does not have to be the last word in anyone's story, that a person can walk out of a locked, frightening chapter of their life and eventually build a home with a wraparound porch, a garden, and a husband who answers the door with exactly 3 words when it matters most. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how easily an entire chapter of fear could have been rewritten by 3 different words, by a husband who hesitated, who wanted more information, who needed convincing before he stood firmly in a doorway on my behalf. I think about how much of my own healing was never really about proving anything to Derek at all, but about learning, slowly and at great cost, exactly what it feels like to be believed instantly, completely, by the one person whose belief was ever going to matter. "I already know," Ryan said, and in 3 words, he closed a door that had been left open, uncertain, for far too many years. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure that door stays exactly where he put it.